billion for the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Program, the $2.5 billion for the Charging and Fueling Grants Program, and the $5.6 billion for the Low and No Emissions Bus Grant Program. Congress gave the Biden administration a tall order in creating the new electric vehicle charging programs. We first required them to establish the Joint Office of Energy and Transportation to ensure coordinated federal investments and policies. We required them to issue detailed technical specifications to make sure that federally funded chargers met certain quality standards. And the Biden administration chose to issue stronger Buy America standards for electric vehicle chargers to ensure that our federal programs are supporting jobs here in the United States. We also required states to create plans to ensure investments are targeted wisely. All of this helps. All of this had to happen before the projects went out to bid. I know some have raised concerns about the pace at which these new programs are unfolding. It is important to deploy chargers as quickly as possible to help spur the transition to clean vehicles, but it is also important to get these programs right. And I appreciate the Biden administration's commitment to doing so. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today about any recommendations to improve these programs. Also, I look forward to discussing the Low and No Emission Bus Grants Program. While the Infrastructure Investments and Jobs Act provided a significant funding increase for the program, demand for these grants still far exceeds available funding. Electrification of our transit systems can provide a roadmap for electrifying other fleets, including our commercial motor vehicles. Moving to a cleaner transportation system will require a good faith partnership between all levels of government, manufacturers, shippers, utilities, and technology companies. I hope all our witnesses will contribute to finding solutions, and I look forward to your testimony. I would like to close by reiterating my strong opposition to H.R. 7526, the DC Consumer Vehicle Choice Protection Act, which would repeal the District of Columbia's regulation adapting Advanced Clean Cars 2. This bill, which the Committee on Oversight and Accountability passed last month, is an attack on DC home rule, the environment, and public health. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentlelady, and now recognize the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Larson, for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you, Chair and Ranking Member, for holding this hearing. I, too, want to take a brief opportunity to express sadness at the loss of my friend and colleague, Don Payne, Jr. He was a fierce advocate for the traveling public. He was a friend to everyone who knew him. I will miss him as well. Turning to today's hearing, electric vehicles are steadily increasing on the nation's roadways, moving both people and goods. Today's hearing focuses on fleet electrification efforts across the passenger vehicle, trucking, and transit sectors. Each of these modes have unique needs and challenges that must be addressed to support a smooth transition to a cleaner and greener surface transportation system. And I would note, perhaps minus some of the rhetoric from the chair, I agree with a lot of his criticisms about how quickly things are moving. We might also differ on solutions, but I don't disagree with some of the challenges that you've laid out. But I would note that fleet electrification is not only good for the climate, it's critical to enhancing our nation's economic competitiveness. The International Energy Agency reports that the number of electric cars sold globally in the first 3 months of this year is roughly equivalent to the number sold in all of 2020. In 24, EVs could reach up to 45% of new car sales in China, 25% in Europe. In the US, that projection is just over 10%. and America's economic competitors are investing in EVs. The U.S. can't take a back seat in this race. Electric and plug-in hybrid vehicle registrations reached record levels in my home state last year, with Washington State seeing the biggest increase in the EV market share of any state. The bipartisan infrastructure law is supporting the adoption of EVs in Washington State and nationwide by providing funding and supporting domestic manufacturing supply chains for critical minerals, including $7.5 billion for EV charging infrastructure, $10 billion for electrification across other transportation modes, and $7 billion in EV battery components and critical minerals. This funding is critical to filling initial market gaps, supporting broader deployment, and enhancing domestic supply chains. Policy changes in the BIL, including new Stronger Buy America standards for EV chargers, are ensuring this funding goes further to support domestic manufacturing. Just 3 years ago, the production of fast chargers was almost non-existent. Now there are at least 26 companies manufacturing these products within the U.S. Last week, I attended an EV charger installation and training event at the Mount Vernon Library Commons in my district. This event showcased how $12.5 million from the BIL Charging and Fueling Infrastructure Grant Program is being used to install 78 public EV charging ports at the Library Commons project. This event also featured an installation demonstration in partnership with the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers Local 191 and the private sector National Electrical Contractors Association Cascade chapter. These organizations partnered to provide training for journeymen, apprentices, and other electrical workers under the collective bargaining agreements in the EV industry. This is an example how shows that investing in fleet electrification can benefit U.S. workers and create jobs that pay well. Also in my district, truck manufacturer PACCAR is using their test center, which is located at the Port of Skagit, and which Chair Graves and I visited along with Representative Brownlee and DeSaulnier last year. They're using their test center to validate the next generation of clean commercial vehicles, and I'm sure that they would love to have any other member of Congress visit their facility to see what this major truck manufacturer is doing on clean commercial vehicles. Today, they offer 6 battery electric truck models and are developing technologies including hydrogen fuel cell electric trucks and internal combustion engines running on hydrogen to get ahead of the market. While access to EV chargers has grown significantly, up nearly 85% in 3 years, almost all of this growth, though, has been driven by private investment. A lot of work remains to ensure communities receive the full benefit of BIL funding. To date, states have opened, and the chair recognized this, have opened only 8 charging stations through the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure, or NEVI program, leading to legitimate questions and criticism of publicly funded charger deployments, ones that can be answered. The slow pace of deployment is partly because the administration took time to ensure these chargers will be made in the U.S. by U.S. workers and to establish standards to create a consistent user experience at the stations. However, as we'll hear in today's testimony, because NEVI projects are delivered by state DOTs, the District of Columbia and Puerto Rico, patchwork of program requirements is complicated deployment. Private businesses looking to build out EV chargers must navigate 52 unique programs, which has slowed deployment and caused confusion. So I urge the Federal Highway Administration and the newly created Joint Office of Energy and Transportation to update the guidance to make this process more uniform. Electrification challenges are not unique to passenger vehicles. The trucking and transit sectors are working to transition their fleets and face challenges with the range, cost, and a limited number of manufacturers. On the other hand, and certainly in transit, they seem to be navigating this fairly well. Through innovation and collaboration between the public and private sector, I believe the U.S. can overcome these challenges, deliver benefits for the economy, the environment, and for U.S. workers. So we're still in the early stages of this major transition. It won't be as simple as flipping a switch, apologize for that pun, and the federal government will continue to play an important role. BIL initiatives are starting to fill in gaps in the market and support the onshoring of the manufacturing process. Congress and the administration must work with global partners to secure supply chains for critical minerals that are essential to EVs and infrastructure. For instance, a newly announced effort between the U.S. and Norway to get a critical minerals agreement. Without continued federal support and action, the U.S. risks falling further behind our competitors in a crucial industry, something no one wants. So I want to thank the witnesses for being here today, and I look forward to the discussion. That I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Now I want to welcome our witnesses and thank them for being here today. Before we get started, I want to take a quick minute to explain our lighting system. It seems pretty self-explanatory, but there are 3 lights in front of you. Green means go, but unlike an and with our stoplights, yellow does not mean proceed with caution as you might expect. It actually means hurry it up because it's fixing to change. You're running low on time. And when you get to the end of that time, you might hear a little reminder that your light has turned red. And we just want to make sure that your remarks are kept to 5 minutes. Ask unanimous consent that the witness's full statements be included in the record without objection, so ordered. Ask unanimous consent that the record of today's hearing remain open until such time as our witnesses have provided answers to any questions that may be submitted to them in writing without objection. So ordered. I also ask unanimous consent that the record remain open 15 days for additional comments and information submitted by members or witnesses to be included in the record of today's hearing without objection. So ordered. As your written testimony has been made part of the record, the subcommittee asks that you limit your oral remarks to 5 minutes. And with that, Ms. Okafor, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Crawford, Ranking Member Holmes Norton, and members of the subcommittee. It's a pleasure to be testifying before you this morning. My name is Kim Okafor. I'm an electrical engineer by training and have worked for the Love's family of companies, building out our EV charging network, as well as other low-carbon fueling solutions. I'm testifying today on behalf of NATSO and Sigma, the leading national trade associations representing transportation energy retailers. Although Love's is the second largest truck stop company in the country, we do more than just sell fuel. We also provide services, amenities, and security that drivers want when they refuel their vehicles. We are agnostic to what type of fuel we sell. We sell gasoline or ethanol or diesel or biodiesel or electricity, just like we sell Coke or Pepsi or coffee or tea. We sell whatever the driver wants. At the risk of stating the obvious, we've found that our customers want the most reliable, convenient, lowest cost fuel available. Our job as fuel retailers is to identify that fuel and to deliver it to every community across this country. We have supported policies that encourage investments in alternative fuels and reward businesses that make those investments. We are, first and foremost, a real estate company. We derive our greatest value from identifying prime locations across the country where drivers are most likely to stop when they refuel. From there, we simply sell drivers the fuels and products that they want in a fast, secure, and convenient setting. The best way to lower the carbon footprint of transportation fuel is through policies that both encourage businesses, such as Love's, to offer more alternatives, and also make those alternatives more attractive to consumers. I cannot emphasize enough how important it is to prioritize the consumer in this conversation. Consumers will not purchase EVs if they are not confident in the charging network, not just how many chargers there are, but where those chargers are located. Many seem to think that EVs need an entirely new refueling network, and that is just not the case. Our industry has spent the last 60 years building out a competitive refueling network that has adapted over time to align with driver preferences, and we want to do this well into the future. We've supported and are actively engaged in EV charging grant programs such as NEVI. I'm happy to say that more than half of the NEVI awards awarded to date have gone to fuel retail sites. Love's has won approximately $30 million to install EV charging stations across our network, and we're extremely grateful for this opportunity and take seriously the responsibility that comes along with it. Public investments in EV charging stations should require site hosts to be financially motivated to provide a positive consumer experience. This motivation should come from anticipated revenue that's realized when the charging stations are utilized and not just deployed. Public funds go the furthest when they mobilize grant recipients not just to install the charging stations, but to provide an ongoing positive consumer experience, even after the public investment program ends. Beyond NEVI, there are other policies that need to be re-examined. The rate that I pay for electricity for my charging station should be the rate that any other business pays. No one should have a leg up on anyone else. This is not the case today. Creating a level playing field will invite additional investments in EV charging stations and ultimately make consumers more willing to buy EVs. If I leave you with one thought, let it be this. Any changes to the transportation energy market in this country must work for the American consumer. If Congress ensures there are competitive market dynamics governing EV charging, then electrified transportation will be available, affordable, and attractive to the driving public. This can be done by leveraging the existing refueling network, ensuring that federal incentives are not squandered, and addressing the structural electricity market impediments to EV charging. Again, I'm honored to be testifying before you this morning. I appreciate the opportunity. I look forward to working together on these important policies and welcome any questions that you may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Okafor. Very well done. Before we introduce our second witness, I want to recognize Representative Ezell to give a short introduction.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm excited about today being here and pleased to honor and introduce one of our witnesses, a lifetime resident of Mississippi's 4th Congressional District with over 47 years of private and public experience in ground transportation, my friend, Mr. Kevin Coggins. Mr. Coggins has a passion for improving transit across the country and has worked in the industry since his high school graduation. In 1989, he joined the Coast Transit Authority as Director of Maintenance Department, where his leadership skills and personality quickly made him a company standout. It took less than 2 decades before he would be picked by his peers to run the Coast Transit Authority, CTA, as the Executive Director. Today, Mr. Coggins boasts 47 years of experience. He's only 50, and in the industry, and he's just done a wonderful job. As anyone familiar with South Mississippi knows, this includes experiences essential for navigating devastating natural disasters, operating tight financial budgets, and finding ways to connect individuals across our hospitality state. I'm excited my colleagues on this committee can learn from leaders in my home district. Again, I would like to welcome Mr. Coggins and thank him for agreeing to, and thank the committee for inviting him here to testify at the subcommittee hearing today. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Ezell. Mr. Cogan, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Subcommittee Chairman Crawford and Ranking Member Norton, thank you for this opportunity to discuss public transit fleet electrification efforts. I am Kevin Cogan, Executive Director of Coast Transit Authority in Gulfport, Mississippi. Coast Transit is a mid-size urban transportation system serving the 3 coastal counties of Mississippi in addition to connecting 3 bordering states. I'm here representing more than 1,200 Community Transportation Association of America members, the majority of which operate rural, small city, and tribal transit systems. In my 47 years of experience in the private and public transportation industry, including 35 years managing alternative fuel vehicle operations, I have been through hurricanes, economic recessions, oil spills, and a pandemic. I have served in my current role for 21 years and was director when Hurricane Katrina made landfall in the middle of our service area. Coast Transit provides fixed route, on-demand, and work commute services, commonly known as van pool. This year, ridership in our system is back to pre-pandemic levels. We are projected to provide 775,000 trips in fiscal year 2024. Operations are funded by the FTA, local and state governments, and self-generated income. We operate our agency without an annual operating deficit. Coast Transit plays a vital role in the daily lives of our ridership. Our riders rely on our system to bring them to work, school, medical facilities, essential locations like supermarkets and tourism attractions. Coast Transit has a mixed fleet of 54 vehicles. We choose low-emission propane in our small to mid-sized vehicles and hybrid or zero-emission battery electric for our large heavy-duty buses. We are currently replacing all of our aging diesel buses with cleaner alternatives. A mixed fleet is our solution to balancing cost, system effectiveness, resiliency, and reaching our sustainability goals. And that's the most important message I bring to you today. Small transit operators like mine and those represented by CTAA all around the country need flexibility to make decisions at a local level based on geography, weather, and service. Coast Transit will meet a 50% emission reduction by 2030 with our mixed fleet of vehicles. Electric is part of our plan, but we cannot commit to pure electric. In 2021, we purchased one 35-foot battery electric bus for $800,000. The same vehicle today would cost my agency $1.2 million. We have 12 small buses currently on order to arrive in the next year, all of which are propane fueled. Systems need choices. Our battery electric buses work well within the confines of our fixed route, but current price and range issues make this technology much less effective and unsustainably expensive for the other parts of our service. Public transportation is already reducing overall emissions by lowering the number of vehicles on the road. We must avoid any federal mandates requiring the adoption of only zero-emission technologies and continue to allow eligibility for low-emission vehicles that makes sense in my community and thousands more like it across the nation. The bipartisan infrastructure law's investment in public transit, as well as the flexibility in funding both low and zero-emission buses, has helped us build back our ridership, acquire new equipment, and complete important local capital projects. As Congress begins to look at surface transportation policy to follow the BIL, I ask that you consider the impact of the extraordinary price increases of zero-emission technologies on local support for vital public transit in smaller cities and rural areas. Coming up with 15% or 20% local match on buses, both large and small, when prices have nearly doubled in the past few years, is a big challenge for CTA and many other CTAA members. It strains the local budgets of the communities we serve. Most of our riders are not interested in the specifics of our buses, but they value reliability, reduced noise, especially in those coastal routes, and our dedication to promoting a healthy environment and community through readily available, flexible public transportation. Thank you for the opportunity to discuss fleet electrification and public transit with you today. I look forward to answering questions from committee members.
Excellent. Very well done, right on time. Probably not by accident, right? Mr. Dalkakis, you're recognized for 5 minutes for your testimony.
Chairman Crawford, Ranking Member Norton, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. My name is Taki Dalkakis, and I'm the Vice President of Vehicle Maintenance and Fleet Service at Pitt, Ohio. Pitt, Ohio is a freight transportation provider that operates in 14 states out of 25 depots and employs more than 3,500 people. Our fleet consists of over 1,550 company-owned tractors and box trucks. Trucking has a positive story to tell about the progress we've made to reduce emissions, and Pitt, Ohio is tremendously proud to be a part of it. We have a long-standing commitment to environmental responsibility on behalf of our employees, customers, and the communities where we operate. Over the past several decades, trucking has cut nitrogen oxide and particulate matter tailpipe emissions by a stunning 99%. As a result, 60 of today's trucks emit what just one truck did in 1988. This progress was made possible through innovation and collaboration. A joint effort between the EPA and the trucking industry established aggressive yet achievable targets on realistic timelines. For this reason, Pitt, Ohio joined many industry stakeholders in supporting the federal Phase 1 and Phase 2 greenhouse gas emissions regulations. These rules achieved carbon emissions improvements as well as delivered real-world fuel savings by using proven technologies. Regrettably, EPA's Phase 3 regulations released this year break from that history of successful partnership. This unworkable mandate ignores operational realities and places a costly burden on trucking companies. Currently, there are extremely limited quantities of battery electric trucks on the road. In fact, less than 1% of trucks registered on the road today are zero-emission trucks. In 2022, after meticulous evaluation and planning with our truck manufacturer, we put into service our first battery electric trucks. They cost 2.5 to 3.5 times more than traditional diesel-powered units, and that excludes charging infrastructure. Although battery electric trucks show promise in certain applications, it is apparent that they are not ready for broad deployment due to technology limitations. Pitt, Ohio clean diesel tractors average 650 to 700 miles per day, and our box trucks average 150 to 200 miles per day. The range is not there to support our tractor fleet, which is where the majority of our vehicle miles are driven. These battery electric vehicle trucks also require long periods of unproductive downtime to recharge and transport less cargo due to the massive weight of their battery packs. These limitations contrast unfavorably with clean diesel powertrains that can refuel in 15 minutes anywhere in the country and drive 1,200 miles. Battery electric trucks also require an enormous amount of energy. Just one truck depot could require the same amount of electricity needed to power an entire town. Delivering this power is another challenge. Supporting an EV fleet would require the construction of numerous power plants and transmission lines, not to mention the installation of at least 15,000 truck charging stations every month between now and 2032. For contrast, the fastest chargers cost $100,000 each. A recent study commissioned by the Clean Freight Coalition calculated full electrification of the commercial vehicle industry would cost $1 trillion for charging infrastructure and utility investment. Fortunately, there are many alternatives that can be taken to zero emissions. Clean natural gas, hydrogen, renewable diesel, hybrids, and other bridge technologies can all be part of decarbonization. Congress should prioritize the carrot over a stick approach by incentivizing truck owners to upgrade to the newest, cleanest models. A newly manufactured truck produces half the CO2 emissions of one manufactured in 2010. Trucking is accustomed to overcoming challenges, but we cannot address these problems if policymakers ignore them or mandate one straitjacket solution. Pitt, Ohio, and our industry have demonstrated that we are wholeheartedly committed to reducing emissions, but it is important that we get this transition right. Trucking is the backbone of our supply chain. Setting us up for failure will have dire consequences for our economy and American consumers. Thank you for allowing me to speak today, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Outstanding, thank you. Mr. Nigro, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Chair Crawford, Ranking Member Norton, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to speak today about the electrification of U.S. transportation. My name is Nick Nigro, and I'm the founder of Atlas Public Policy, a policy and data research firm based here in Washington, D.C. Atlas equips businesses and policymakers to make strategic, informed decisions that serve the public interest. I appreciate the opportunity to speak to you about the most important transportation challenge we face this century. In the last 15 years, our innovative businesses, with support from government and civil society, have made great strides to transition the country off oil to a more sustainable, secure, and economical fuel, electricity. 2023 was a banner year for electric vehicles, with new U.S. sales exceeding 1.4 million. For comparison, it took us nearly 8 years to reach the first million EV sales. Passenger vehicles often steal the headlines, but truck and bus electrification is also underway. The number of electric trucks deployed nationwide jumped from only 1,200 in December 2021 to nearly 18,000 in June 2023, with trucks in every state. Fast charging stations necessary to make an EV as easy to own as a gas vehicle are experiencing a similar surge. 25% of all operational fast charging ports were installed last year. Make no mistake, this transition will take decades to complete, but we have too much at stake to lose the future of mobility to our competitors in China and Europe, which made up 85% of global EV sales in 2023. The Alliance for Automotive Innovation estimates that the automotive sector supports nearly 10 million jobs in the United States, and the International Energy Agency estimates that global EV sales could reach 17 million in 2024, more than all passenger vehicles Americans purchased last year. The need to advance EVs goes well beyond our economic interests. The American Lung Association estimates that zero-emission trucks could lead to 65,000 fewer premature deaths by 2050. Moreover, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration estimates that climate-related disasters have cost us nearly $2.7 trillion since 1980, with costs increasing every decade. Lastly, all the evidence I've analyzed has led me to the conclusion that electrifying transportation is vital to our national security, and it's impossible to put a price tag on that. To complete the transition off oil, we must set up a policy framework that puts us on a better footing globally. Since the Infrastructure and Investment and Jobs Act was signed into law in November 2021, we have tracked $141 billion in announced investments in EV manufacturing, with at least 80% of these investments flowing to Republican congressional districts. These investments will support 160,000 jobs, including 59,000 jobs in disadvantaged communities. As the clean economy ramps up, we're prioritizing those who we have historically been left behind. Combined, the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Program and Charging and Fueling Infrastructure grants funded through IIJA is the largest investment in charging in U.S. history. These programs take a thoughtful, complementary approach to building out charging infrastructure, helping to ensure all Americans can use their EV to go anywhere they want. In addition, the power, port count, and reliability requirements raise the bar for a nascent industry and provide certainty on how companies will deliver a customer experience akin to gasoline refueling. By the end of 2024, we expect NEVI-funded stations will be open or under construction in most states. IIJA also supercharged the popular low and no emission program. Last year, $1.2 billion was awarded to projects in nearly all states, with 70% of funds going to zero emission technology. The boost is timely, as the 7 largest transit bus fleets, making up 60% of the market, will purchase only zero emission buses in the next 8 years. Congress can use the Surface Transportation Reauthorization to redouble its efforts to support electric vehicles. Specifically, Congress should renew the NEVI and CFI programs and update requirements to meet the near-term needs of EV drivers by doubling the power level per port and the minimum number of ports per station. Second, Congress should support truck electrification by targeting charging along rights-of-way and at shared public sites to support small businesses. Congress should update the low-no program to focus funding on zero-emission technology, as it is the best option for the environment, human health, and our economy. Thank you for the opportunity to share my perspective today. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Nigro, and thank all of you for your testimony. We'll now turn to questions from the panel. I recognize myself for 5 minutes for questions. Let me start with Mr. Dalkakis. I appreciate you raising a number of the challenges that trucking fleets, both large and small, face as they consider how to respond to decarbonization policies without bankrupting their businesses. You also shared with the subcommittee the significant multi-year investments that the trucking sector has already made to reduce its environmental footprint. Talk about more of the challenges associated with only running Class 7 or Class 8 battery electric trucks and why Pitt, Ohio has chosen to have a fleet with different fuel options.
Sure. Thank you, Chairman. In terms of hurdles, I would say there's 3 buckets to consider. It's technology, infrastructure, and cost. So from our experiences, the technology was not readily available until 2 years ago for initial demonstration projects. In fact, we were one of the early fleets to bring battery electric medium-duty trucks into our operation. The range, the payloads, significantly less than the current conventional trucks that are on the road today. So when you think about what that does to our operation, it changes the dynamics of what we do and how we do it. Infrastructure, significant hurdles. So we have 25 depots. We've considered electrification in 12 of those depots, 10 different utilities that we have to work with. I can share stories with you that, we did a lot of work on the facility side many years ago, Chairman. We electrified our forklift fleet. Today, we're 42% electrified. The reason we're not 100%, we do not have the power to support electrification in those facilities. So those are small loads. As we talk about medium duty, heavy duty, it's a very large load that we're bringing to the grid. And those projects to electrify our depots are taking a long time. We have an electrification project today that will have taken 2 years from start to finish to get 3 megawatts of power on site. And that's just for a small project. And we're ahead of the curve. And then lastly, I would say is cost. So what we've seen pre-incentives, 3.5 to 4 times the cost of a conventional vehicle. We have seen significant cost increases over the last 2 years for conventional vehicles. And I just signed an order agreement for 3 trucks, $1.5 million. It's the equivalent of 10.5 vehicles in the internal combustion engine technology. So as I mentioned right now, our hurdles are centered around technology, and the technology is improving. It's the infrastructure, which is a large challenge, and it's the cost of the technology moving forward.
Thank you. In your testimony, you highlighted the Roland-Berger study that I mentioned in my opening comments. Can you give us a little bit more about the real-world electrification challenges raised by that study? And I guess I'd like to know how difficult it would be for the trucking sector to meet both the Biden administration's carbon reduction goals in addition to what California wants to require.
There are a lot of folks working really hard to move this forward. In terms of that study, a lot of the charging that has to happen for our fleet has to be behind the fence charging. So that's a significant investment of resources. And we're a larger organization. We're family-owned, but the majority of trucking companies today are small businesses. And the reality is they do not have the infrastructure, the teams to kind of move this forward. In our experiences over the last 3 years, it has taken a team to move these small projects forward. So that's one aspect of it. The other piece is from a duty cycle standpoint, in the Roland-Berger study, there's a lot of investment that's going to have to happen in corridor charging. That's fine, but it is going to have a significant impact in terms of how we do business today. During the day, our fleet does city deliveries. At night, they do line haul deliveries, which are terminal to terminal. We average 520 miles a night. We have drivers that operate over 600 miles a night. That is not possible if we have to stop and recharge for 30 minutes to an hour. So there are some significant hurdles. I think the study does a good job of shining a spotlight on the significant investment that's going to have to happen, but there are some challenges that I see with that study as how we move forward.
Thank you. Mr. Cogan, real quick, you mentioned the inclement weather that down on the coast that you deal with. I'm curious how that inclement weather would impact your ability to function if you were all electric, given the Katrina scenario, for example. Can you talk about that?
Yes, sir. Hurricane Katrina was a Cat 5 devastating hurricane who pretty much destroyed our entire community. Our public transit agency is a very important part of evacuation and recovery. During these events, we're part of the Harrison County Emergency Management Agency. We're totally responsible for Emergency Support Function 1 transportation. So we're called upon to meet all of the needs of the community when these events happen. And so we provide evacuation transportation. That's the easy part. After the storm, if it's devastating, people lose their homes, their cars, power. It could be out for weeks at a time, like Hurricane Katrina. If we were 100% electric, we would not be able to support the community in that type of a power outage. So that is a critical issue for us, being able to meet those needs.
Thank you. My time has expired. Ranking Member Holmes Norton.
Mr. Nigro, we have heard some discussion today about the cost of transitioning to cleaner vehicles. Congress has a role to play in alleviating those costs, but we would be remiss not to also speak about the significant benefits of a cleaner transportation system. What are the benefits of electrification, both in terms of human health and avoiding environmental catastrophe?
Thank you for the question. So let me start with the tailpipe. With no tailpipe, we see huge local air emission benefits immediately in all the areas where an EV operates. I mentioned earlier that the American Lung Association estimates that zero-emission trucks could lead to 65,000 fewer premature deaths by 2050. They performed a similar study for passenger vehicles, and they found that with that combined with reducing emissions from the electricity sector, where the power comes from, could lead to 89,300 fewer premature deaths by 2050. So that's a lot of human health benefits. A new analysis from Bloomberg found that EVs produce about 70% less carbon dioxide equivalent emissions than gasoline vehicles over their lifetime. It's important to highlight the lifetime aspect of this because we have been actively decarbonizing the electrical grid for some time. There's an old adage in the EV space, the dirtiest days of your EV is the first day you take it off the lot because the grid is continually getting cleaner. You also asked about the benefits of avoiding environmental disasters. I highlighted what NOAA does, and frankly, at Atlas, we're quite jealous of their work in tracking climate-related disasters, because it's all about making that data publicly accessible. They estimated that it cost us nearly $2.7 trillion in climate-related disasters from all kinds of events since 1980. Those costs, importantly, are increasing each decade. So the problem's getting worse. And so the sooner we act, the fewer costs we'll have to endure in the long term.
Well, Mr. Nigro, federal electric vehicle charging programs have taken time to implement, as the Biden administration first had to follow a congressional directive to create a new joint office and issue technical standards to ensure a consistent charging experience nationwide. The administration also chose to issue a stronger Buy America standards for electric vehicle chargers. I believe the administration did the right thing. Were those steps worth the extra time it took to get these programs implemented, Mr. Nigro?
So that's a great question, because for folks who don't work closely with state DOTs, from the outside looking in, the law was enacted, and for some time, not much money has been spent installing charging, at least from the outside looking in. But as an engineer, similar to Ms. Okafor, I'm also an electrical engineer. State DOTs are engineering-focused organizations, and what they want to do, and what we like to do as engineers, is plan and make sure that we get everything right before we commit resources. And the reality of NEVI in particular, the first 12 to 18 months was just doing that, building up capacity within the state DOTs to hire people. Many DOTs had never done an EV charging program before, so they had to either bring in outside help or hire new resources, and they had to submit plans for how they were going to implement their program. So all of that takes time, but it's important because it's building long-term capacity within the DOTs. And what's become evident, and watching again from the outside on what is happening within DOTs, it's quickly becoming a core part of what they do as a Department of Transportation, not just building roads and bridges, but also making sure that mobility as a service is provided. And EV charging is an increasingly important part of that. And so in essence, these plans are essential because we want to make sure that the money that gets spent here from IIJA is transparent, it's efficient, and it's equitable. And that is going to take time, and that's something that we've had to accept in the recent past. On the other hand, I mentioned earlier the funding is starting to go out the door. And so by the end of this year, we expect that there's actually going to be stations open or under construction in most states. And now that the DOTs many of them have issued awards, I expect that we're going to see a lot more NEVI stations open up in the near term, because these sites are actually relatively quick construction sites.
Thank you, Mr. Nigro. My time has expired.
Thank the gentlelady. Mr. Webster.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Okafor, this is a pretty simple question. Where does the electricity come from that charges these batteries?
Thank you for the question. There are a number of different ways that electricity is produced throughout the country. There are a number of production plants, and then the utility agencies throughout the country transmit that power out to the demand locations, which are EV charging stations.
So do you, the Biden administration wants to have 500,000 stations opened up. Do you there's only been 8 built so far, okay, so pretty much they still want 500,000. So do you know if there is enough power somewhere out there being generated right now to support those 500 stations?
It's an extremely important question. The utilities throughout our country have a very significant job on their hands to make sure that there is enough power that gets transmitted to these EV charging stations. Quite honestly, they're our partner as we think about the value chain, so working together with the utility to help them understand when we're going to put in chargers and how much load we require so that they can build the utility power production plants as quickly and effectively as possible. It's a better question for a utility agency, but it will be a significant challenge throughout the country.
Yes, because permitting is not the easiest thing in the world to do. And depending on what kind of power plant you're permitting, for a nuclear plant, probably not going to happen in our lifetime. So I just wondered, if that be the case, how much for an average battery-powered vehicle that runs before the batteries run down, how much does it take in power to recharge those batteries?
Different OEMs have different battery packs in their systems. At our locations, we've seen that customers usually stay and charge at a fast charger for between 20 and 40 minutes, and they take somewhere between 30 and 40 kilowatt hours per charge.
Okay. So if all 500,000 of those are operating at one time, that's a lot of juice.
It's certainly a significant amount of power, more power than we use right now. You're correct.
So how much does it, what would be the time frame to permit and build an electric station? What does it take to do that?
For an EV charging station, the typical build time for an EV charging station altogether is 12 to 18 months. I would say the 3 long lead items in that schedule is 1, the procurement and manufacturing of the charger. 2, it's the utility upgrade. That by far is the portion of the schedule that's the most hardest to predict. We don't get that much information from the utility early on. And then 3rd is exactly what you're saying, permitting. Because we have no control on how long the AHJ takes to permit our stations, we're really, we're dependent on the AHJ to review it in a timely fashion and to get the permit out to us. On average, we see permitting taking anywhere between 1 and 3 to 4 months max.
Do you have to get a permit if you're just adding on EV power?
You do, yes. So at a location like Love's, that's already a fueling station, you do have to get an additional permit to add chargers to our stations.
So would that be the same as if it were new or add-on? It would be the same amount of time, you think?
Say that one more time. Would you repeat the question for me, please?
Okay, so you said that they have add-ons on stations that already exist, and then there are new stations that exist. Does it take the same amount of time to do either one? As far as electric power, I'm not talking about the whole station.
For just the charge, it depends on what it is that you're building. But if you're, let's say you're building a new truck stop, permitting the truck stop itself, it takes a significant amount of time. So it does fall within, permitting the truck stop, permitting that EV charging station falls within the time frame of permitting the truck stop.
Is that 2 permits, or do you just permit the whole station? And it could be or may not be an EV station.
For an EV charging station, you typically need a build permit and I believe a structural permit. I wish I had my design build manager up here with me. He would be able to answer that question much easier than I would, but there are different sorts of permits that you need. For a truck stop, obviously, you would need much more than that.
Okay, go back.
Gentleman yields. Mr. Larson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Those are great questions outlining that most of these, there's a bucket of challenges that have nothing to do with the federal government and a lot to do with everybody else. And one of the main issues, and I want to come back to you, I have a question for Mr. Nigro, I want to come back to you. One of the main issues is you're dealing with local utilities that basically, even though they wheel the power or send the power, they own it. They own your access to it. And it doesn't matter if you're building a charging station, commercial facility, industrial facility, the utility is the gatekeeper on your power. But Mr. Nigro, I made the point, the chair made the point, that the NEVI program's only funded 8 charging stations, soon to be 20 with the 12 that will be located. immediately, and a total of 78 at the Library Commons project in Mount Vernon. But still, it's a challenge, and it's not a great story. And can you talk a little bit about how we can accelerate the federal funding to get chargers funded?
So when it comes to NEVI, there was just a significant amount of time required to stand up the program. I'm actually quite confident that DOTs are going to be issuing funding opportunities in rapid succession. Many have actually already on their second round of funding. And so, as I mentioned earlier, I think before the end of the year, I would expect more than half of the states to have either sites under construction or open at this point.
Yeah, but so to date, even though the number is 8, do you have an estimate of the number of chargers that are actually deployed total, regardless of who's funded them?
Oh, you mean in addition to NEVI? You know, how many?
Yeah, 8 plus how many? Yes, right.
No, I don't have that number with me, but I
Is it
can.
100? Is it 200? Is it 1,000? Is it...
Fast chargers available to any American right now in the public. It's somewhere near 10,000.
Somewhere in 10. Okay,
Yeah.
right. Great, thanks. Thank you. So back to Ms. Okafor. So you mentioned some of the challenges. Are there things that we can do to clear the brush on these challenges?
Yes, what it really reminds me of is the biodiesel incentive structure. So Love's is one of the leading blenders of biodiesel throughout the country. And what the incentive structure that biodiesel had was a two-sided structure. One, you had incentives for infrastructure, and the other side, you have incentives for the energy or the fuel to go to the consumer. On the EV charging side for NEVI, we've incentivized the infrastructure and haven't incentivized the demand to get the consumer to be incentivized to buy these electric vehicles. So increasing the demand for the charging stations would make the economics for the infrastructure much more easier to bear. So the help that we would be looking for is on incentives on incentivizing drivers to buy these EVs.
Yeah, thanks. And then Mr. Cogan, Todd Morrow was here a few weeks ago. He's Island Transit in my district, speaking on behalf of CTAA, testifying on a separate set of issues. But they're also going to electric and propane because they're a rural transit agency as well, and so they're going to do a fuel mix as well. We've seen quite a number of, at least in Washington State, I'm sure around the country, both urban, suburban, and rural transit agencies adopting low and no emission and working through that transition as well with their own sets of challenges. So when you're done, if you will, done with your transition, what will be your fleet mix when in terms of fuel?
Based on current technology and budgetary constraints, we're using propane for small and mid-sized vehicles, and we're using pure electric on the big buses. Mix of our fleet, 54 vehicles, is currently 20% gasoline, 52% diesel, 27% propane, and only 1% electric. We only have one 35-foot heavy-duty bus. We have 12 buses on order now that are going to be propane to replace diesel. So we're going to go from 27% to 39% propane by the end of the summer this year. Going forward, we don't know what that's going to look like. We're looking at pure electric. Pure electric is more expensive than the other technologies. There's cost to that, and we also are blessed to live in a community with clean air. We're not in a non-attainment area, but I personally think that federally funded public agencies should be taking the lead in alternative fuels, and there's a bunch of alternatives other than electric out there. If you have really bad air quality issues, certainly electric is the way to go, but we don't. So our current strategy is, as I said, using propane. It's cleaner than diesel. less expensive to operate and cheaper than electric, but electric is totally clean. So just depends on your weather, geography, operating requirements. So going forward, 20 years from now, who knows what the technology and the costs are going to be. And if we wind up having air quality issues, it will certainly be electric for us. But right now, the plan is not for pure electric.
That's great. That's helpful, and I appreciate, Mr. Chair, and I'll follow up with Mr. Dalkakis and some questions on trucking. But if I had time to yield back, I'd do it.
All right, gentleman yields. Mr. Bost.
You know, Mr. Dalkakis, when I look over the panel, I'm trying to figure out which person I could ask this of. I was born and raised in the trucking business, actually dealt with a whole lot of hazardous material, including AMFO for mines, gas, diesel, propane. When you start working with electric vehicles, what's the higher danger of when you start moving hazardous material, when we're talking about charging stations and the intersection of all of those? Do you know?
Yes, I can comment on that. From our standpoint, we move a lot of hazardous material products through our LTL network. We also do flammables, explosives. So there is a concern. In fact, the way we were structuring charging today, we do it away from our dock facility because of the risk and the potential hazards with thermal runaway on those electric vehicles. So we could reduce the impact of infrastructure stress on our facilities if we had confidence to plug those vehicles in at the dock as the units were being loaded. But today the charging happens away from the dock. In fact, recently there was a fire in Columbus, Ohio, where a partner LTL carrier had lithium batteries that were coming back, that were being sent back in, defective, and they had a thermal runaway that shut down a 1 mile radius in the Columbus area and shut down the terminal operations. So it's real. We are considering it and looking at it, and I think that's why we're walking into this slowly as the technology evolves.
I think there's some concerns that many of us have. You know what? We'd all like to have clean vehicles. We'd all like to have where it's perfect. But what we don't say about the electric vehicle is the ability to create a grid powerful enough to handle that. I worked for 20 years in the state legislature on the public utilities, and our base load would not handle increasing to the point that we're talking about through this administration. But with that, Ms. Okafor, I know that Love offers EV charged hydrogen, compressed natural gas, renewable natural gas, biodiesel, to name just a few. You do provide all of it. Now, in your opinion, if this administration focuses on electric limits and limiting investments in other types of alternative fuels. Now, another problem that's out there is China currently controls EV charging market and majority of the refineries for the critical minerals that are used to manufacture batteries. Are there any alternative fuels that you deal with that you believe that we as the U.S. can become energy independent with and actually keep ourselves away from the big fear that we have of China?
Thank you for the question. It's a great question. When I think about the incentive programs that we have in place today, and in some cases mandates that we have in place, it strikes me that we may be doing this in the reverse order. Some of the challenges that you've mentioned are things that I believe that we should be focusing on. What are the solutions to those challenges? So as we move forward in determining what the energy transition should be in our country, focusing on solutions to challenges is what I think that we should be doing.
Yeah, and the only thing that I would also close out here, I don't want to drag on too long, but the frustration that we feel. You know, this nation has been really, really, really good on allowing the free market to work. And I'm going to tell you something, that whenever the internal combustion engine was created in this nation, guess what? Government didn't have to go out and set up gas stations. Who did it? We, the free people. What we did was we had entrepreneurs that saw a golden opportunity. If electric vehicles come to a point where all of a sudden you yourself, along with your companies and everything like that, have put in, if you can use the electric vehicles, but taking existing taxpayer dollars to build an infrastructure that it's not time for yet seems a little confusing to most of the people out here. Because right now, we can't charge to the level we're talking about. As good as it may sound, and it's wonderful to quote statistics as long as you're quoting your statistics that support you. And I think on this issue, maybe we ought to wisen up and let the free market system work. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Ms. Brownlee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Throughout our nation's history, we have been at the forefront of transportation and transportation innovation. When the first locomotive steam engine was developed, we innovated and adapted and built a coast-to-coast nationwide network of interconnected railways for both passenger and freight movement. When the combustion engine was invented, we innovated and adapted and built a nationwide network of highways and bridges and fueling infrastructure for automobiles and trucks. When the airplane was invented, we innovated and adapted and built a robust nationwide network of airports for passengers and freight transport. So I'm a bit perplexed by those who question the United States' ability to innovate and adapt and build a nationwide network of zero-emission fuel infrastructure. I think instead of putting our collective heads in the sand, we should double down on investments to innovate and adapt and ensure the United States is on the cutting edge of innovation for our future. So my first question, Mr. Nigro, is to you. When this committee debates electric vehicles, we often hear concerns related to cost and range or technological barriers from those who oppose EVs, and these challenges are real, but I believe American ingenuity has a role to play in solving them to address the broader goal of reducing carbon pollution and certainly sustaining life on our planet. Your testimony notes that China and Europe together made up 85% of EV sales in 2023. If we don't act quickly, the U.S. risks falling further behind. What will happen if the U.S. concedes the race on this new economic front to other countries?
That's a big question. And the answer is complicated because it's going to depend in part on how the industry responds if in the near term. So as I mentioned in my testimony, China and Europe are ahead of us right now when it comes to electrification. The other facts are the industry is committed to zero-emission technology in part because they want to build vehicles for those markets. And so the U.S. is currently playing catch-up. With the enactment of IIJA and IRA, we are catching up quite quickly. I mentioned earlier that more than $140 billion of announced investments in manufacturing across the EV supply chain here in the United States in the last 4 years, so that's a good sign. But we're going to have to keep that going for at least the next several years in order to get to capacity where we can process minerals for batteries, assemble new vehicles, and frankly, build all the types of vehicles that the American consumer wants. For the most part, in the early days of the EV market, it was focused on some of the higher-end, more expensive luxury vehicles. Slowly but surely, the market has started to offer more and more affordable vehicles. And in fact, this year, the most popular conventional vehicles that were sold, vehicles like the Toyota Camry, the Ford F-150, they have electric alternatives that when you look at the whole ownership cost of owning that EV, it's in that conventional vehicle, it's cheaper to own the EV. And so right now we have vehicles that are out there that are competitive, but we still have a ways to go.
Thank you for that. And so also I wanted to ask you, we've heard a lot today already about concerns about the trucking sector's ability to move forward with clean vehicles. Do you see reasons to be optimistic that the U.S. can succeed in transitioning to zero-emission commercial trucks?
Yes, I do. And it's in part because, again, the industry is stepping up. The three truck manufacturers that make up nearly 3/4 of medium and heavy-duty market, Daimler Truck, Volvo Group, and Navistar, they aim to only sell zero-emission vehicles by 2040. And so these manufacturers, along with a handful of fleets, logistic companies, charging developers, electric utilities, all the key players in this industry, formed an association just recently here in Washington called PACT. And it's focused entirely on trying to get more zero-emission infrastructure out there. which frankly appears to be the biggest barrier right now to truck deployment, is making sure the infrastructure can get deployed as quickly as the trucks can be built.
Thank you for that, and Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Mr. LaMalfa.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It just seems about the only thing we hear about in committee on the floor is CO2, climate change all the time, pounded. And I like to go back to when California was, excuse me, incentivizing via regulation, moving people out of the trucks and buses they had into cleaner vehicles, moving them to Tier 4. And there was this implied promise that once you get everything updated, out of 2011 or newer engines, that once everything's Tier 4, we'll leave you alone for a while. Yet, what happens? This kick to electrify everything kicks in during this administration, and now they want to electrify everything from your car, your truck, to your barbecue, okay? Because it's just a fad now. And I think that when we're mixing up what elements are actually pollutants versus someone's idea of inconvenience, for example, yeah, we got to do better on methane, we got to do better on particulate matter, NOx, things like that. But CO2 is not this problem. All the time we hear CO2 is the enemy. So I'd like to ask the panel, what are we even shooting at here? What's our goal here? So Mr. Nigro, you first. What % of our atmosphere is CO2?
So I have to tell you right up front, I'm an engineer, not a climate scientist. And so as an engineer, I just know I can't learn everything about everything. I really have to build my work on the shoulders of others. And in this case...
Okay, well, you're in here, and you're part of a whole parade of people that comes through this committee and others that never seems to know what the target is. For the rest of the panel, I'll just save you. The percent of our atmosphere CO2 is 0.04%. Yes, the average person on the street, with all the hype, they think it's somewhere between 20 and 50%. It's 0.04. Yes, it's crept up a little bit in the last decades. But if we go below 0.02%, plant life dies off. It's essential to plant life. Yet we're turning our economy up on its head because of CO2 and the hype that is being made by all the regulators on this. CO2 is not a poisonous gas unless you breathe 100% of it. It's ridiculous what's going on here. And so in converting everything, all this, we're doing a giant disservice to our school districts, to our truckers, to consumers that have to buy things that are delivered by things that cost much more. A truck, for example, or a school bus. Now, I saw one of my local districts bought an electric school bus here. They're in the middle of farm country in Northern California. There must have been some massive grant or incentive in order to do that, because they didn't just go out and buy it themselves. So these buses cost anywhere from $150,000 to $220,000 is one of the figures I have. I hear higher figures from folks in the other part of my rural district, much higher numbers. They can't afford to do this. So panelists, anybody want to weigh in on how much is the subsidy that on the average truck or bus in order for somebody to buy this? Because we keep hearing we need to incentivize, we need to, government needs to play a role in this. And the point was made a while ago. Government wasn't buying gas stations. Government wasn't propping up internal combustion engines back in the, when they first started really kicking in the 20s or 30s, whatever. People were doing that on their own. Yes, we built the interstate highway system after General Eisenhower saw how great that was in Europe and such. But what is the real goal here when we've had Tier 4 engines in California be the thing that we were supposed to shoot for, and now they've completely changed the game? So, Ms. Okafor, you have those Love's truck stops. Please weigh in on the impact of truckers no longer being able to afford the trucks and all the infrastructure, especially when they're tearing out the infrastructure to generate electricity in California, such as hydroelectric dams.
It's a wonderful question. Our focus is providing the fuel that our customers need. We believe that in order to move customers into, or consumers into, a different sort of fuel, they have to be incentivized to move in that direction.
But that costs a lot of money to the taxpayers. We always say government needs to do something. It's the taxpayers that pays for all of this. And so time and time again, when government says, well, we have set new goals, it means they have goals that cost the taxpayers money for something that when I visit a Ford dealer, people don't seem to want, okay? They don't seem to want these. Ford is losing their rear end, like $130,000 is the figure I saw reported per vehicle, because they've already reached their saturation point with those. I'll yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields. Mr. Stanton.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Let me first say a brief word about the passing of our colleague, Donald Payne Jr. I've been in Congress for 3 terms now. I've had a chance to work with Congressman Payne as a leader here on the Transportation Infrastructure Committee. He was an impactful leader in this body, certainly an impactful leader inside the Democratic caucus. He was our leader on rail safety issues, and he did an outstanding job at an important time in America on the issue of rail safety. He was an impactful leader on the issue of supporting, advocating for people suffering from diabetes and bringing down the cost of insulin and other pharmaceuticals that people suffering from diabetes needs. He was a quiet leader, but a really impactful leader, someone I respected greatly, and he will be greatly missed. Arizona and my district have benefited from the electrification dollars that came through the bipartisan infrastructure law. In January, City of Mesa received nearly $12 million to install 48 electric vehicle charging ports, charging docks for e-bikes and e-scooters, and solar canopies to support electricity generation at the stations. These initiatives will ensure that EV charging is accessible to all residents, regardless of their location or employment. Last June, Valley Metro, Arizona's transit agency, was awarded over $13 million to purchase zero-emission buses. And in 2022, the city of Phoenix received a $16 million low-no grant to buy hydrogen fuel cell buses, battery electric buses, and charging equipment as part of the initial phase of the city's zero-emission transition plan. These dollars are helping our local cities. Not only will transitioning to electric buses lower emissions, but it will significantly lower long-term fuel and maintenance costs, saving taxpayer dollars. But we are on an aggressive timeline, when we need to be thinking strategically about how we use every tool in the toolbox to future-proof both our bus fleets and our heavy-duty fleets. My bipartisan bill to reauthorize the Energy Efficiency and Conservation Block Grant Program will provide grants to states, local and tribal governments to support initiatives that will reduce fossil fuel emissions and conserve energy. It will allow municipalities to use the funds to install fueling equipment, pumps, EV charging stations, et cetera, to enable the fueling of alternative fuel vehicles, giving fleet managers alternatives to the use of gasoline and diesel. This could include providing equipment for refueling with biogas, compressed natural gas, and hydrogen. Ms. Okafor, your day-to-day work is managing EV charging, hydrogen fueling, and solar businesses. You mentioned in your testimony that any changes to transportation energy must work for American consumers. I couldn't agree more, and that means it must work for you to distribute it. Can you describe how Love's been working to integrate electrification and hydrogen fueling into your business model?
Absolutely. So we started putting in our first EV charging stations over 7 years ago throughout the country, and over the last 7 years, we've installed them at about 30 to 40 locations across our network. And what we've been doing for the last seven years has been learning about the market, learning about driver behaviors, utilization, how to charge for electricity as a fuel, and we've learned a lot. And because of all of the work that we've done over the last several years, we have been able to attack NEVI as aggressively as we have been, and happy to say that we've won $30 million to date to build 50 new EV charging stations. It's really been on the back of everything that we've learned thus far, and our hope is to win even more money to build out more of our network. On the hydrogen fueling side of our business, we've taken a different approach, a different lane. The Trillium portion of the Love's family of companies, one of our major customer bases is transit agencies. And transits have been moving much faster on the hydrogen fuel cell side of the industry, of the market. So to date, we have designed and built and operated and maintained 5 hydrogen fueling stations for transit agencies behind the fence. And if and when our heavy-duty customers need hydrogen fueling at our Love's truck stops, we'll be able to do so quickly because of everything that we've learned with our transit partners.
That's really great. You also talk about how bringing in alternative fuel does not necessarily mean revamping the entire market. Can you expand a little bit upon that?
Absolutely. Our core is our customers. So having a place for them to fuel their vehicles is exactly what we do for them today, no matter what the fuel type is. What customers really want is reliable fuel, convenient, and lowest cost fuel available. They also want amenities that they're used to and that they need whenever they refuel their vehicles. These amenities include fresh foods and different items that they can purchase, places where they can sit and eat, dog parks, clean restrooms for mothers that are traveling with children, diaper changing areas, all of these, and most of all, secure locations, well-lit parking lots where they can charge and fuel their stations. So everything that our industry has been providing for the past 60, 70, 80 years is everything that EV drivers need today.
Thank you so much, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Mr. Stauber.
Thank you very much. Appreciate the testimony from you all. Ms. Okafor, great to see you again. You mentioned in your testimony that you are concerned with unfair competition with utilities owning and operating charging stations on the back of ratepayers. I'm also concerned about that. Recently, we saw this debate play out in my state of Minnesota where a utility proposed to build, own, and operate public charging sites. The project's multi-million-dollar price tag would have come from its own ratepayers. As you can imagine, this received sharp criticism. What would have happened to the market in Minnesota if the Public Utility Commission had approved that proposal?
Absolutely. I really appreciate the question and great to see you again as well. The only way that we can get a return on our investment when we install EV charging stations or any fuel is to make sure that the customer experience is as positive as possible. Our goal is to have consumers return to our sites to get fuel as well as other amenities that they need when they stop to refuel their stations. We have to ensure that our experience is consistent and great every single time. That's the only way we get a return on our investment. For utilities that deploy charging stations and get their return in other methods, that makes it such that there is an unlevel playing field. They do not have to prioritize consumer experience.
So I believe in all of the above energy strategy and all the best will rise to the top. Do you all agree that forcing the American consumer into purchasing electric vehicle is the way, or should we allow the free markets to make that happen? Does anybody want to comment on that? Do you support the free markets and choosing for the American people to choose their own vehicles?
From my standpoint, I do, Congressman. I think because it offers us flexibility, and it's going to allow for the appropriate technology to move forward to support whatever we're doing. So I think there's a great need to allow for that moving forward. And that's why we have a fleet that operates on diesel. We're looking at renewable diesel. We have compressed natural gas vehicles that have run within our fleet, and we're looking at electric vehicles as well.
Mr. Cogan, free market?
Yes, sir. Current FTA regulations allow transit systems like us to provide the types of services that our community needs and operate the types of vehicles that meet those operational needs. So there's two issues here. There's air quality, tailpipe emissions, and then there's budgetary constraints. And we feel like what we're doing meets our needs. We're reducing our tailpipe emissions in a cost-efficient manner. So there's this talk about internal combustion engines and the finances of that and the emissions. We chose to use propane, and I'm not here today to just talk about propane because we're operating a lot of things, and I'm not anti anything, but a propane bus costs the same as a diesel bus. And propane is cheaper to operate. Cost per mile is cheaper because the fuel is cheaper. A bonus is we're reducing our emissions, so we're not fixated on CO2 and emissions. That's a bonus. The diesel engine requires diesel emission fluid, which is very expensive. You have to put in there. That goes into the operating cost. It's been our experience that the diesel emission control systems that's on these heavy-duty engines that we run are very expensive to maintain. They're cumbersome. They're not reliable. Frequently, the engines go into what's called regen, where they're burning off impurities because we do a lot of idling. Diesel is not a good option at all. So propane is, the upfront cost is as much and operating cost is much less.
And I think you're seeing a lot of school districts across the nation going to propane buses just because of, Ms. Okafor, do they, where do they prioritize the location of the charging stations at the businesses? Where do they prioritize?
The priority is to have the charging stations in a place where customers and consumers can actively find the chargers and easily find the chargers. I took a road trip from Oklahoma City to Houston in an electric vehicle because I wanted to understand the experience of an EV driver. And what I found is that in a lot of cases, it's hard to even find the charger. And it's hard to find a charger that is co-located with amenities that I want because I'm sitting there for 20 to 40 minutes. So finding the charger has been our priority.
Mr. Chair, if you indulge me, I will tell you that this government has paid $7.4 billion for electric vehicle chargers, and they've so far installed 7 of them, and it's been 2 years ago. I yield back.
I think gentleman yields. The chair has been notified there is a series of votes. Before we break for votes, I'm going to recognize Mr. Garcia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am delighted, and you and the ranking member for hosting this hearing about transitioning to clean, sustainable electric vehicles. In Chicago, PACE, one of our transit agencies, they debuted its first electric bus this past January, and they have 22 more buses on order. This is not only a milestone for building a sustainable transportation sector, but also for meeting demands of rapid decarbonization. There's concern over the limited number of bus manufacturers and the lack of capacity to produce electric buses needed in a timely manner. Mr. Nigro, it's encouraging to see how many local transit agencies want to transition to electric buses. How can we ensure that our markets are prepared for this demand so that we can complete orders on time?
It's a great question. Industry will respond with market certainty. So when you provide it with demand for a product like electric buses, they're going to ensure that the manufacturing capacity is expanded to meet that demand. It's what we're seeing right now in passenger vehicles. The Inflation Reduction Act set up a framework to encourage domestic production and assembly of electric vehicles, and we've seen $141 billion of announced investments as a result. And so as more transit agencies commit to zero-emission vehicles, I would expect the supply to be made readily available.
Thank you. Electric vehicle technology and infrastructure is critical to a district like mine, surrounded by highways and industrial development, with some of the worst air quality in the country. Cutting pollution from gasoline and diesel fuel would give my constituents years of their lives back. No Republicans voted for the Inflation Reduction Act, and very few House Republicans voted for the bipartisan infrastructure law, yet their districts are reaping benefits of those laws through new electric vehicle manufacturing plants and the creation of jobs, and this is good. Mr. Nigro, can you speak about the economic benefits and jobs that districts across the country are seeing in the electric vehicle sector?
Yes. So I mentioned earlier, this is a once-in-a-century transition. Going from internal combustion engines to electric drive is a huge undertaking, and it's going to require considerable investments in manufacturing across the country. That's a competitive opportunity. As I mentioned earlier, of the $141 billion that have been announced since November of 2021, 80% of those investments are flowing into Republican congressional districts. So the evidence is signaling that those districts are setting up an environment that's attracting that kind of investment and jobs, 160,000 jobs. You mentioned earlier this importance of equity, essentially, reducing emissions for people who are experiencing transportation emissions and what it does to their health. Importantly, the jobs that are being created right now are also encouraging investments in disadvantaged communities. So communities that are historically been left behind are now front and center. And I think that's another positive effect of what's going on right now.
Thank you. And we've seen efforts to unionize amongst auto workers, opening new electric plants. Volkswagen workers in Chattanooga, Tennessee, voted last week to unionize, the first Southern auto workers to win their union in history. Mr. Nigro, can we ensure that EV manufacturing benefits disadvantaged communities and has done so with fair labor contracts to support a new generation of sustainable careers?
One of the benefits of electrification is the amount of attention that's put on all aspects of building an EV, from every aspect of the supply chain to the labor force that's being put together to design, build, and deliver these vehicles. I think it's no coincidence that what you're seeing right now in EV manufacturing facilities is greater interest in ensuring that the jobs that are created are fair paying and good jobs that are really building new sustainable communities. A lot of the facilities that are being built right now in different parts of the country, they don't have necessarily a tradition in the auto sector. So this is a brand new opportunity for them to create a new sustainable community. And with this increased intention, I think we're going to see more positive results.
Thanks again, and with that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields, Mr. Johnson.
Ms. Okafor, my questions will be for you, or my conversation will be with you. Your really great policy team at NATSO and Sigma have taught me that y'all aren't in the gas selling business. You're in the serving travelers business. Am I putting that right?
You've got it right.
And so in your testimony, you talked about being technology neutral, but you're not a partisan with regard to what fuel you're selling as long as your company can make money doing it, right?
Absolutely.
So talk to me a little bit about the negotiations with public utilities. And obviously, you've got stores all over the place, so I'm sure you've got a variety of stories, but give me a sense of how that normally goes.
Yes, you hit the nail on the head. We have over 640 stores in 42 states. And with that, you have hundreds of utilities that we have to talk to, we have to partner with. And we've been talking to them a lot lately because of the work that we've been doing with NEBI. And really the way the conversation goes is we let them know that we want to build an EV charging station. We ask them for two things. How long will it take to get the power that we need to our station, and how much will it cost? In some cases, they give you an answer. It's usually vague because they haven't done the analysis themselves, which makes it extremely difficult because for the investment, the utility portion is always a black box. One example of that is we were building out a charging station out in Coachella, California. We had originally thought that the utility upgrade there would cost $50,000. Come to find out, the utility upgrade, whenever they did the engineering analysis, would cost over $300,000 and take a year to install. So that uncertainty makes the investment challenging.
I think everybody realizes that the fuel part of your business is a pretty tight margin business. I assume that's true whether you're selling electricity or gasoline. It's a little hard to recover a $300,000 line extension fee, I would think.
It is difficult to recover that sort of investment, especially when utilization is low. The other thing that's difficult to recover is demand charges. The demand charge is related to the number of kilowatts that is utilized, the highest number of kilowatts that's utilized over a 30-day period for 15 minutes. So even if you have one car come for 15 minutes and use 100 kilowatts, and you have a demand charge of $10 per kilowatt, you're talking $1,000 that you have to recover. Well, that customer leaves and pays $15. We're left holding the bill. So with utilization being as low as it is, and the electric rates for utilities across the country being challenging, it's hard to recover the investments that we make and even the operational costs that we incur.
So a lot of these components they're tariffed. I assume in some jurisdictions, the utilities have a little bit more flexibility than they do in others. But I would assume something like demand charges are filed in tariffs. Do the public utilities commissions, did they provide a lot of flexibility to these public utilities on how they charge you for demand charge?
I'm not particularly, I don't have very much detailed information on how rate structures are chosen. What I will say about rate structures is because we don't have any control over the rate that we pay, it can change without my knowledge. For instance, there was a charging station that we have out in California. We reached a certain demand, and for certain rates, if you reach a certain demand for a number of months, they move you into a new rate structure. But they don't tell you that they move you into a new rate structure. So I was looking at the P&L of our business, and I noticed that they moved us, but I hadn't moved the cost that I charged to the customer. So that lack of transparency, the lack of knowledge on when things are happening and how they're happening, and the lack of ability to choose a new provider puts us in a very tight spot, and it makes the investment extremely challenging.
Am I right in assuming, Ms. Okafor, that all of this unpredictability and relative lack of control puts some downward pressure on your interest in making these kind of investments?
It certainly makes it extremely challenging. At the end of the day, our goal is to provide the fuel that our customers need, but furthermore, the goal is to make a return on our investment. And if the utilization isn't high and the return is challenging, it makes it hard to make the investment.
Thanks very much for sharing that, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. There is a floor vote called, a series of votes, so I appreciate the patience of our witnesses. We're going to have to take a short recess to address that floor vote, and so the committee stands in recess, subject to call of the chair. Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure will reconvene from the previously recessed hearing. The gentleman from Mr. Desaulnier is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for this hearing. Just a couple of things. The idea that the free market dictates everything, I think just we really live in a mixed market, and the forces of trying to get this right is difficult. But if we look at the rest of the developed world, the market's already determined what the energy future is, what we have to do for infrastructure. The Chinese are adding 100,000 battery electric charging stations and fuel cell stations a month. The EU is about half of that. California, which I'm proud to represent, and 1994, I was appointed by a Republican governor when I was a Republican to represent the Bay Area Air Quality Management District on the California Air Resources Board. So, and the Clean Air Act that allows California to do what it's done, as I've mentioned this committee before, was signed and by Richard Nixon. The California Clean Act was signed by Governor Ronald Reagan, and the zero-emission vehicle mandate was mandated by Governor George Gumagian, a conservative Republican from Fresno, where the fossil fuel industry has significant investments. So when we got this right, I think when we get this right, we're what we used to refer to on CARB in Republican administrations as we were fuel neutral, that the private sector with underneath the regulations, the laws, we're allowed to incentivize and innovate to meet their reductions on traditional pollutants, and then we've been allowed to do that by the courts so far under carbon emissions. So having said all that, to me, this is economic security. You don't have to read everything David Jurgen has written about the fossil fuel industry and energy industry to understand whoever controls energy has a disproportionate advantage for their economy and their constituents. His book, Commanding Heights, talked about whether the British understanding wind and navigation or the US and Europe understanding fossil fuels. But the fossil fuel industry is not the free market. I have a district where Chevron, the second largest petroleum company, is headquartered. I've got 5 refineries in the area I represent, more or less, in the Bay Area. They're important. They contribute significantly. But they are subsidized. Brookings did a study just a year ago that said that in the US, the fossil fuel industry gets direct subsidies, tax credits of $500 billion a year. And that's decisions we and others make because it's important as employers and is very much needed for the economy. Having said that, we're transitioning. Most of the studies that I've read is when we get the infrastructure done, not just for carbon, but in terms of efficiency, the car operations, trucks are more of a challenge given the need for the power to generate big loads. But all of that thing is to say the Congress is important in figuring out how we transition effectively. And within that, if the fossil fuel industry can come up with carbon capture or something that works, then so be it. But this idea that somehow fossil fuel industry just happened completely organically and John Rockefeller was a wonderful person who didn't have sharp elbows is just not accurate. So, Mr. Nigro, in your experience, and I'm proud of the fact that my bill, the Clean Corridors Act, got put in the Infrastructure Reduction Act, but placing these are no small. It is hard, and so were gas stations in the early 1900s. But getting this right and being efficient about it and letting the market to dictate within it fairly is a challenge, and not misrepresenting it. But my question to you is, if the Chinese are 60% of the electric cars in the world, they have an advantage in terms of the chemicals that are needed, and the national labs at Lawrence Livermore, near my district, has identified the Salton Sea prospectively as being a source of those critical elements, up to 375 million, but we have to do it the way we do it, is environmentally safe. So briefly, that was a long introduction to a simple question. What happens if we don't do the right investments and we just keep going with fossil fuels the way we always have?
Well, I'll try to be respectful of the time here and say briefly that the costs of climate change have continued to rise within recent decades. That's the data from NOAA. That's showing $2.7 trillion in total costs since 1980. I think we can expect the cost from climate-related disasters to accelerate as a result of us not reducing emissions sufficiently. The other flag I would give to you is the security implications of that. Part of the reason I moved to Washington a long time ago was what I perceived to be our dependence on oil and the national security crises that resulted from that in the early 2000s. I don't think anyone in this room would want to repeat those experiences again. And so there's many facets of fossil fuel dependencies that's hurting us, whether it's the planet, our economy, or our safety.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back, and I recognize Mr. Owens from Utah for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and ranking member and other witnesses here today for taking time to hold today's hearing to highlight the delusion of the Biden administration's at-any-cost approach on electrification of our grid. For almost 60 years, Americans have been driven by fear, perpetuated by climate theorists, authors, climate absolutists, and climate change activists, all who consider themselves experts. These experts who, for decades, with total confidence, set dates every 10 years for the end of the world doom. Then, with no shame, as we run through those dates, they predict with another 100% confidence, another 10-year decline. For decades, we witnessed American taxpayers supporting government-generated wealth. This has been done by propping up industries through the power of bureaucratic mandates and subsidies, in direct contract to best cost, most convenient, best value products offered through the free market. Nothing has been more apparent with this tactic than the $18 billion taxpayer funding of a mandated industry that Americans, private citizens, and business owners do not want to be forced down their throats. This can be seen in the projection by Biden's administration on the growth demand of EVs over the next 6 years. Biden DC bureaucrats, absent of any actual industry input, have decided what the American consumer must buy by 2030, that's in 6 years. They've decided that 50% of all American car purchasers will buy an EV, whether they like it or not. The facts are that as of 2023, only 7% of cars purchased by the American consumer were EVs. Yet this unrealistic leap to 43% in 6 years has not caused one moment of pause by the DC maestros. We would think that the first steps to meet such an aggressive growth goal, one that impacts our U.S. economy in so many ways, would have been a roundtable discussion with industry experts. These experts would have included utility stakeholders, cybersecurity experts, truck drivers, state DOTs, and a swath of working Americans who stake their livelihood on predictable transportation. Of course, this taking the industry's input never happened. If it had, the advice from the industry experts and stakeholders would have been put on the brakes. Your projections and mandates for this industry are premature at best, very dangerous at worst. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses to learn how arbitrary and delinked from reality mandates and rules have affected everyday working-class Americans. I'd also like to see that what this committee can do to mitigate the coming transportation one-size-fits-all nightmare that is being predicted by industry experts. Mr. Dalkakis, trucking is already a high-risk industry with very slim margins. Can you speak to reliability and durability of electric vehicles and some of the challenges and limitations your drivers might face?
Sure. Thank you for that question. As the Vice President of Maintenance, my focus is on keeping the fleet rolling. So operational uptime is really critical. I think where we're at today, we're early in the maturity of the technology in those vehicles. So, the trucks that we put in, they are more complex. We have seen some downtime with those vehicles, and as opposed to a day in the shop, it can be a much longer period of time to work through those repair processes. So,
okay. I'm going to ask you another question. I also serve on the Education Workforce Committee. So from the labor perspective, what type of training and technologies would drivers be forced to utilize to meet the Biden administration's very aggressive goals?
So from a workforce training standpoint, At Pitt, Ohio, we're in a transition. We're a 45-year-old company, so we have folks that are retiring every day. And from a knowledge and education standpoint, I have technicians that are very diverse in terms of their age diversity. So there is a heavy investment in electrical knowledge. We're dealing with high voltage equipment. There is an absolute need to put resources into tech programs, workforce development. The ecosystem has to be developed to support this. The reality today is when you look at electrification and this technology, dealers are certified if they have 2 technicians so that they can do the work. But the reality is technicians don't always stay in one place, and life happens. So we have to invest heavily in building this next generation of technicians that will support the technology.
Ms. Okafor, I'd like to ask you real quickly, with the industry that you run and work within, why is it important to allow the consumer to be at the very front of making these choices in terms of how we spend and where we spend our time with this energy?
Absolutely, I appreciate the question. The best way to get consumers to buy EVs is to make them what they want, to make the experience of owning the EV better than the alternative. When we incentivize the market to move in that direction, the entire supply chain is consumer-based. When we mandate it, we take shortcuts, such as installing chargers in parking lots and other undesirable locations. I understand the temptation to mandate EVs or to ban gas vehicles, but there are no shortcuts. We need to make sure that consumers have what they want and make it what they want it to be.
Thank you. You're back. Thank you so much.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back, and I recognize Mr. Johnson of Georgia for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank the witnesses for your forbearance. That was a long period where we were absent, and I appreciate you all's testimony and you all sticking around for this round of testimony. I want to read to you something that comes out of a Bloomberg news article dated March 28, 2024, written by Tom Randall. It goes as follows. New technologies have a tendency to blindside. When color TVs were introduced in the 1950s, for instance, they seemed like a flop. The devices were expensive, programming was scarce, and after a decade on the market, few homes had one. Then suddenly, prices dropped, a ratings war ensued, and in just a few years, most U.S. households were watching the Jetsons in its futuristic palette. A comparable shift is currently underway with electric vehicles, according to a Bloomberg Green analysis of adoption rates around the world. By the end of last year, 31 countries had surpassed what's become a pivotal EV tipping point, when 5% of new car sales are purely electric. This threshold signals the start of mass adoption, after which technology or technological preferences rapidly shift. Mr. Dalkakis, in your testimony, you addressed the costs of transitioning to cleaner fuels, and you call for a slower transition. But if we fail to act soon, the clean vehicle market is going to develop in other countries, particularly China. Has the ATA considered the cost to the industry if in the future we become reliant on China or other foreign nations for our commercial motor vehicles?
Could you repeat that last part?
Yeah. If we fail to act soon about adopting electric vehicle technology, we'll be left behind. And has the ATA considered the cost to the industry if in the future we become reliant on other nations, particularly China, for our commercial motor vehicles?
Thank you. I think when you look at the American Trucking Association, even up at Ohio, I don't think anybody is putting the brakes on moving forward with the technology. I think what we're saying is that there is a diversity of technology needed to support supply chain. And when you look at how critical supply chain is to what we do on a day-to-day basis. We cannot put technology in place that is not going to allow your goods to get to your operation.
If we slow down everything, we slow down everything. So if we adapt as we move forward, adapting, we will have the infrastructure that will rest or come to rest in place to support these commercial motor vehicles. So, I mean, I understand the fear of it not being there right now, but the technology and all of its attendant services and necessities will be there as it unfolds, just like it has been in the past. Ms. Okafor, could you comment about this transition to EV technology and EV vehicles?
Absolutely. Thank you for the question. Loves has supported policies that encourage investments in alternative fuels and reward businesses that make those investments. What it makes me think about is our biofuels business. Loves has been a leader in biofuel blending in the industry, and the way that that market has been incentivized is twofold. On one side, there was an infrastructure incentive. On the other side, there was an incentive on the energy or the fuel. So it made the fuel lower cost to the consumer. On the EV charging side, we have the infrastructure incentive, and we're aggressively going after it. What we're missing is the incentive on the demand, the fuel, to get it low cost to the customer so that fleets can have an attractive option for their operations. So I believe once incentives are included on the demand side to incentivize customers to buy these new technologies, then the market will be consumer-oriented, consumer-driven, and it would move much faster.
So you think we should incentivize the acceleration of the conversion to EV vehicles rather than slow down?
I think that we, in order to move to new technology, similar to what we did in the biofuel space, the way that, what made it move was making the alternative technology solution a better solution than the traditional solution. So making it better than what the traditional solution is would provide an opportunity for fleets to continue with their operations.
Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back, and I recognize Mr. Ezell from Mississippi for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and thank you all for being here today. And, you know, we all want better. We all want better transportation. We all want a better environment. And you know, I think we can figure this out with good old American know-how in a timely manner. So, Mr. Coggins, thank you again for being here today. It's an honor for somebody from my district to be up. And all of you witnesses have just been opened my eyes to a lot, especially since I do travel through the Loves stations quite regularly in my home state, and going back and forth to see my granddaughter. So thank you all. Mr. Coggins, you have done a great job, and we all know what you've done for us on the coast, providing reliable service for many decades. As the cost of fuel has risen, you've adopted by transferring a portion of your fleet to low-emissions propane fuel buses rather than all-electric. This must have been a challenging decision, especially in more rural areas. Can you talk about some of the steps that you took before finalizing this transfer and how it's impacted your fleet?
Yes, sir. I've been doing this a long time. I've personally been really watching technology evolve for decades, trying to find the right fit for Coast Transit Authority. So we have two issues that we consider at our transit system: the air, the environment, and budget constraints. So we're phasing out all of our diesel because of emissions and the high cost of operating diesel. We have chosen to go with propane short-term in the small and mid-sized vehicles because they are much cleaner. They cost about the same to purchase up front, but the operating cost is much less than a diesel engine bus. Fuel consumption, the cost per mile is much, much lower than diesel, and we get the benefit of lowering emissions. So we have clean air. We're not a non-attainment area, thank goodness. Hopefully we won't be. But we also are looking at EV, full electric buses. Technology is advancing. On the small to mid-sized buses currently, what's on the market is not a fit because of cost and mileage constraints, range. We have those two things. Yes, they're zero emission. If we were in a poor quality area, non-attainment, we would most definitely be looking at full electric EV, but EV is the most expensive solution to lowering emissions. So we think we have found the right mix for our community, and our community does expect us to be running alternative fuel vehicles, but we have cost constraints. We're funded by 5 cities and 3 counties, and because we don't have bad air quality issues, I cannot go to our local governments and ask them to fund EV technology, but at this point in time, it's not a necessity for us. So the funding is just simply not there.
Very good. Thank you for that. And the Biden administration seems to try to, what we see, continue this one-size-fits-all policies across industries. This is especially true in transportation. You know as well as I do, that works for someone in a large city, but it's not going to work in Gulfport, Mississippi. You mentioned in your testimony you feel strongly about no federal mandates. How can the federal government serve as a partner in enhancing the transportation goals in our communities and without federal mandates?
Sure. We currently do not have a federal mandate. There are goals set by the administrations, and we have agreed with 50% emission reductions by 2030. We're on track to do that, utilizing the technologies that I talked about. So there currently is no mandate. Federal Transit Administration does support alternative technologies other than zero emission. If you look at the low-no grant system, which over $1 billion a year to 5339C, it's called, there's a specific allocation in that dedicated to low-emission vehicles, and we take advantage of that. We currently have a $1.8 million grant that we received under that program to buy these 12 propane-fueled vehicles. And so to answer your question, what could FTA do going forward is to keep the regs like they are, allow us the flexibility to operate the buses that we need to meet our service needs in our environment in a cost-efficient manner, and continue to allow other than zero-emission vehicles to be purchased with federal grants. We would appreciate that, and also more money into that system. There is a lot more money requested in all of those grants to purchase vehicles than is currently available. We're all struggling, and CTA is as well, with older fleets, trying to replace them, and there's just not enough federal money in those programs to keep our vehicles in a state of good repair.
Thank you very much, and thank you again, all of you, for providing us with input. Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back, and I recognize Mr. Menendez from New Jersey for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Madam Chair. In January, New Jersey received a $6 million grant to improve EV charging reliability in the state. And last November, NJ Transit and New York Waterway received a nearly $7 million grant from the FTA's Passenger Ferry Grant Program, funded by the IIJA to electrify 2 commuter ferries in New Jersey's 8th Congressional District. I was thrilled to support these crucial investments in electrification in our region, which will help keep our air clean and our community moving. We know that thanks to the historic funding from the Inflation Reduction Act, transit agencies across the country have received grants to kickstart their conversion to greener fleets. We also know that these transit agencies are often operating with limited budgets or even at a deficit. Mr. Nigro, how important are these federal dollars to help transit agencies acquire more climate-friendly vehicles?
It's absolutely essential. Right now, many transit agencies struggle to cover capital costs and rely on federal programs from FTA in order to purchase new equipment, whether that be for buses or trains. When we look at the transition to zero-emission vehicles, there's considerable amount of upfront costs that's also needed in order to operate these vehicles and with respect to infrastructure. And that's another strong role for particularly the Low-No program that's been mentioned a few times in order to support the build-out. I just want to flag a couple of things just for your information on this trend here. So zero-emission technology is still in its, let's say, its first wave across the economy, even though there's been transit buses that have been electric on the road for some time. We still have a long way to go. But the trends are clear. 7 states had zero-emission bus deployments rise by about 50% in the last year. And the largest transit agencies, 7 largest transit agencies in the country that operate buses, so LA's transit agency, Boston's transit agency, WMATA here in DC, they make up more than 60% of the total fleet, and they've each committed to purchasing only zero-emission buses in the next 8 years. So they're going to rely on Low-No and similar programs from FTA in order to make that transition.
Absolutely. And we know that climate change and pollution have a disproportionate impact on environmental justice communities. We also know that while EVs stand to improve health outcomes for Americans across the country, access to charging infrastructure remains a challenge, as we've discussed here today, especially for renters and underserved populations. Mr. Nigro, how can we ensure equitable access to zero-emission vehicles for everyone, particularly in historically underserved communities?
I'm glad you brought that up because part of the purpose of the NEVI program and the CFI program is to fill in infrastructure gaps. It's not entirely building out infrastructure from scratch. We've had thousands of charging stations deployed in the last 10 years before NEVI, before the IIJA was enacted. Big part of what it's going to mean for consumers who don't get to charge at home, which is somewhere near 35% of the population of households, don't have easy access to home charging, is going to be through public charging, and some of that's going to be funded through CFI and through NEVI. I want to just mention, though, while we're talking about this, without funding from public programs, it's likely that charging wouldn't necessarily be deployed in disadvantaged communities, in part because EVs aren't as popular in those areas at this time. And part of it is that we all talk about chicken and eggs in a lot of scenarios. This is real. If you park on the street or if you park in a parking facility that doesn't have easy access to home charging and you're a renter, you probably don't have an easy way to install a charging station at your home. And so you're going to rely on public charging. And if there are no EVs there, there's not necessarily going to be a private push. And that's where government can help lead the way, and also electric utilities. They've been an instigator in getting charging in a lot of disadvantaged communities in some areas.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And we represent one of the most densely populated districts in the country. And so we have a high number of renters, and making sure they have access to these EV charging facilities is critically important because there is a move and there is a demand, especially in a place like New Jersey. So we have to be a good partner here at the federal level to ensure that we provide those resources to get those EV charging stations and infrastructure into all types of communities. And that's why this work is so critically important. Thank you all for your testimony here today, and I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back, and I recognize Mr. Yakum of Indiana for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, and thank you to our witnesses for being here today. Back in December, this subcommittee hosted top Department of Transportation officials for an oversight hearing. This included Shaylin Bott, who heads the Federal Highway Administration, or FHWA. The FHWA oversees the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Program, or NEVA, which is devoted to building out EV charging infrastructure. NEVA is flush with $5 billion of cash, yet it is responsible for bringing only 2 charging stations online through the end of last year. This is something we talked about in the hearing last year. I want to register my disappointment because I asked Administrator Bott that in that hearing, how many charging stations his agency projected that NEVA would bring online this year, in 2024. He didn't have an answer offhand. Fair enough. But he promised to, quote, follow up with a very specific number. 3 months later, I finally received a response, but no, quote, very specific number. Just a promise that NEVI and other related programs would, quote, ensure that a rapidly increasing number of reliable EV chargers will be operational around the country this year, unquote. I suppose in one sense, NEVI has been bringing charging stations online at a rapidly increasing pace in 2024. There have been an additional 6 NEVI-funded charging stations placed in service thus far this year. But $5 billion was supposed to be enough funding for 5,000 charging stations. And yet, after 2.5 years, we have 8. It's clear to me that NEVI has become yet another example of the federal government wasting taxpayer dollars by gumming up a program with red tape. In this case, it's unworkable labor standards, confusing minimum operating standards, a rigid mileage requirements that prompted at least one state to ultimately decline NEVI funds altogether. That's not mentioning permitting, transmission, and other hurdles that grantees may encounter along the way. Ms. Okafor, what actions could FHWA take today to reduce red tape and streamline this process?
I appreciate the question. The NEVI program that has been deployed is being passed out by state DOTs, state agencies. They come up with competitive solicitations, bids for folks like Love's to bid on. To date, we've been awarded $30 million for 50 new stations. And there's a pretty lengthy process to get from the bid phase to actually procuring the chargers. The bid itself takes time, contracting takes time, and then you have to go into the procurement of the chargers themselves. The thing that is difficult with NEVI is that the federal rulemaking gave quite a bit of leeway to states. So each state analyzes or understands the federal rulemaking differently. And because of that, they're deploying or awarding these funds differently. One of the goals of NEVI is to have a harmonious network across the country. The most important thing from our perspective is to ensure that there's a positive consumer experience, which means co-location of amenities with these chargers and the requirement of co-location of amenities.
So in that regard, again, what steps do you believe they should take? I mean, you talk about the regulatory environment, the rulemaking process. What specific steps should they take to make this more streamlined so that in 2.5 years we can push out more than 8 chargers on a $5 billion program? Give me like maybe one specific thing that they could do to make this a little bit more efficient.
I think more straightforward rulemaking guidance from that all states can take on. What I mean by that is each state looks at the federal rulemaking and comes up to their own interpretation of what it means. And because of that, each solicitation is completely different.
So it's fair to say that the rulemaking that occurred created confusion with the states where no one actually understands what the rules are? Sounds like that's, am I hearing you correct?
I can't speak for the states on what they understand or what they don't understand. What I will say is the differences in the interpretations between the states makes it so that the applicants, each solicitation is different, and it makes it so that the applicants take more time because each state is different.
So on behalf of my constituents, the 750,000 people who are American taxpayers, do you believe that American taxpayers should accept the fact that there are only 8 charging stations out there from $5 billion?
I can't speak to that specifically. What I can say is that all of the solicitations that have come out that make sense for our organization, we have bid on those aggressively. We've been really competitive in that. Because of that, we've been awarded, and we hope to continue to be awarded.
Thank you. And Madam Chair, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back, and I recognize Mr. Molinaro from New York for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think I'm going to follow up a little bit on the last set of questioning, but I want to offer, I come from New York, where we have big expectations, but don't necessarily meet on the deliverables when it comes to full build-out of EV capacity, and I certainly have embraced sort of the all-of-the-above approach without question. I also think, however, it should be driven by consumer interest in the market, and of course, at this point, when it comes to EV vehicles, we know that the demand is not moving as aggressively as was originally projected. And in communities like the ones I represent, there's a reason why. They seem unattainable. and the capacity to access EV charging, whether it's stations themselves or the infrastructure just doesn't exist. And so, Ms. Okafor, I think I know you've answered these types of questions all afternoon or day at this point. Where do you think we are in the total build-out nationwide in EV charging capacity, but in particular in rural communities?
I really appreciate the question. What it makes me think about is the network that our industry has built over the last 60 years and being able to leverage the refueling network that has been built by this industry and how it's going to be extremely useful. The place that rural communities has to play in the EV charging market is extremely significant. For EV drivers, the majority of drivers either charge at home or at their workplace. But when they're traveling I live in Houston and I travel to Dallas, that's when I'll need an EV charger. And I'm going to charge in between Houston and Dallas in the rural communities. So the rural communities have a very significant place in this market. And our locations the majority of our locations are in those areas. And it'll be really important for this market to move forward with having those in between sort of locations.
Understood, but you would agree that meeting the expectations of the administration, the mandates that are being set, we're just not, this is not my observation, we're just not going to meet those expectations with the current infrastructure, in particular in rural communities. And I'll move, though, specifically to what are, I think, in many cases, a bit overly ambitious mandates. How do rural communities not get forgotten? They'll be averaged out, in other words, right? We'll make great capacity expansion in urban centers, in more densely populated areas, but in the rural communities, they're just going to be a rounding error when it comes to whether or not the administration meets the mandate expectation. How do we meet the build-out capacity in rural communities?
It's really going to be extremely dependent on getting the power to the rural communities that are needed for the EV charging stations. If I think about our network that we have today, one of our highest, we have two locations that perform very highly. One is in Quartzsite, Arizona. The other one is in Davenport, Florida. We're not talking about major metropolitan areas. We need rural communities, but making sure that we can get the power to these stations will be extremely important.
So that truly is the answer to the question, and certainly in a state like New York, where, quite frankly, much of our electric infrastructure is, high demand and under great stress. The EPA recently issued a final rule which requires truck manufacturers to accelerate the production of electric trucks. Obviously, beyond the massive upfront costs that small businesses will be required to shoulder as a result of the new rule, we know there needs to be an increase in grid capacity. We know this, and the suggestion has been capacity needs to increase by over 3,000% by 2035 in order to meet just the electric light-duty vehicle load. So for any of you, from a place like the communities I represent, this just doesn't seem practical. And I'm I was a local government guy. We set expectations that we can meet, and it just doesn't seem that we can meet these expectations. With 30 seconds left, how do we meet an aggressive timeline like that?
The good news is we have a lot of actual grid capacity that's underutilized at night, which is when most folks are parked at home, particularly folks who live in rural communities. What we've seen so far with the deployment of some millions of EVs to date is there hasn't been a lot of issues with respect to the grid, in part because 65% of Americans live in single-family homes and have easy access to power in their garage or near there.
They can't afford it.
That's not to say that it's not going to be a lot of work to get to 100%, but there's a large share of the market that can be accommodated with the existing grid capacity.
I'm over my time, and I'll just say respectfully, that is an oversimplification of the challenge in rural communities and accessing affordable electricity, let alone adequate electricity for this purpose, is far beyond the reach of many in rural and less than suburban communities. With that, I'll yield back.
Thank you. I was afraid I was going to have to use my gavel, Mr. Molinaro. The gentleman yields back, and I recognize Mr. Kiley from California for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'd just like to ask straight up. I'm from California. We have this executive action that has banned gas-powered vehicles starting in 2035. Mr. Dalkakis, do you think that that is feasible? And regardless of whether it's feasible or not, what will be the consequences for consumers of trying to reach that point within the next decade?
I think it's aggressive in terms of the technology and where it is. And I think, I think early adoption participation now will start to drive some of the costs down. But based on what I see, it's going to increase consumer costs to all of us. When we look at the cost of the new technology, we're not talking about 0.5 or 0.6 more. We're talking 3x and 4x, and that's without the infrastructure investment. So
3x and 4x meaning 3 times as many
correct
vehicles.
That's correct. Oh, well, 3 to 4 times the cost
Or 3 to 4
of a
times the
traditional
cost.
vehicle.
Right,
Yes.
of a traditional vehicle. And so significant cost increase for consumers. Do you agree, Mr. Cogan, as far as the feasibility and the impacts?
Yes, I do. It's very costly. Electric is the most expensive solution. If you look at a 35-foot heavy-duty bus, which we're running, the diesel model is $670,000. The hybrid, which is a diesel engine driving hybrid, is currently $855,000, 28% more. And the electric version is $1,150,000, which is 35% more. That does not include the cost of the charger. We paid $135,000 for a charger that will charge 2 buses, and we had to upgrade our power supply from the power company for $40,000. So it's very expensive up front to implement these EV technologies.
So this is a big impact for folks in my state who are already struggling with the highest cost of living in the country, highest poverty rate in the country, precisely because of the cost of living. To sort of layer on all of those additional costs would impose a major hardship for drivers, which is why I'm supporting the Preserving Choice in Vehicles Act, which says that we're not going to do these bans of gas-powered vehicles within these artificial timelines. It passed the House with bipartisan support, but it is yet to get a vote in the Senate. So I think that I would strongly encourage the Senate to move on that bill in order to preserve choice, because we all, I think, are excited about what the future holds in terms of clean energy. I mean, Ms. Okafor, you work with a lot of clean energy technologies. Is it your experience that what drives innovation in the clean energy sector is more the work of innovators or mandates on the part of government?
It really is. It more has to do with the consumer's choice. The consumer has to want to move to this new alternative, and we have to provide an environment where they want to move from what they traditionally are using to the new alternative.
Thank you. I've always been of the view that the way that we can usher in the clean energy future that I think is in front of us is through innovation rather than regulation. And I think that these flat-out bans within an arbitrary timeline are sort of the ultimate example of overbearing regulation. I wanted to ask you about one other topic, Mr. Cogan, related to buses, because I've talked with several school districts within my district where they get extreme weather, where they get a lot of snow, and having electrified buses just isn't practical for them. Has that been your experience as well?
Well, we live in an area that does not have snow, so we're fortunate there. But we have a lot of heat, extreme heat, and we run air conditioners. I have heard of the cold weather-related problems with EV vehicles. I don't have any personal experience with them. We do not, in our area of the country, have a problem with our EV vehicles. In terms of range, I think it speaks to the point that in our industry, public transit, we would like to continue to have the flexibility to operate the types of vehicles that meets our operational needs and our climate with our weather and our geography, all things considered. I think that would be what I would point out. It's a strictly a local decision what works for the individual organizations.
That's very well said, because just the school districts I'm referring to are in very rural, spread out areas, get a lot of snow, and a one-size-fits-all mandate from a centralized bureaucracy just doesn't work for them. Thank you very much. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back, and I recognize Mr. Burchett from Tennessee for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, ma'am. It's good to see some names up there that will be just as much butchered as mine will today. So I just want to thank y'all for that. Mr. Okafor, did I get that right? Close? Ms.
Mrs.
Okafor? Mrs.
Yes.
Mrs. Yes, ma'am. Okay. It seems like truck stops in East Tennessee, such as Pilot or Love's, have alternative fuel types at their facilities. Is the federal government currently, in your opinion, standing in the way of development and deployment of alternative fuels types other than electricity?
Would you restate the question, please?
Yes, ma'am. I'll cut through all the fluff. It's about alternative fuel types at facilities, specifically in East Tennessee. I'm wondering, is the federal government currently standing in the way of development or deployment of alternative fuel types other than electricity?
I wouldn't say they're standing in the way. Well, the alternative fuel types that maybe I'll say two things. One, we deploy whatever our customers need. So if our customers need electricity or renewable diesel, biodiesel, ethanol, then we deploy that infrastructure. The second thing is that we follow policy extremely closely. So we have supported other, federal government incentivized infrastructure, and we've invested in that, and we continue to support those sorts of investments. So moving into alternative fuels, if the investment makes sense, we'll continue to do that. But what I'll reiterate is a two-sided incentive structure is extremely important, not only in incentivizing the infrastructure side, but also the demand side, the energy, the fuel that goes to the customer. If you don't incentivize that side, then you continue to have an economic structure that's extremely imbalanced, and investment will cease.
Thank you. Mr. Nigro, our nation is over $34 trillion in debt, and it seems like many rural Americans are struggling. And given that the average American produced EV costs $53,000, why do you think this administration is pushing EV-related mandates on these hardworking folks?
I'm very glad you brought that up. I think your stat probably is correct about the average price of an electric vehicle. The thing that's important for all Americans to keep in mind when they're buying a vehicle is most of the cost is in the ownership cost of it, right? The cost of fuel, the cost of maintenance. We ran the numbers on the most popular vehicles of different types, the F-150, Toyota Camry, Toyota Corolla, and an electric vehicle equivalent. For sure, up front, they cost more. But over time, through fuel cost savings, since most people can charge at home at very low cost, you end up actually saving money in the long run over the total, what's called the total cost of ownership. So counterintuitively, EVs are actually less expensive to own in general, particularly in passenger vehicles.
I'm going to follow up with that, if that's okay. In March, the EPA announced a final rule that would require up to 2/3 of new cars and trucks sold in the U.S. to be EVs in 8 years. The president's EV mandate, I feel like, is a little bit out there. We don't have the infrastructure, the power generation, nor the domestic supply chain to meet these demands. I'm often wondered too, is people they don't take into consideration the slave labor that's involved with these batteries, the fact that these so-called rare earth minerals that maybe we could get here, there weren't some of the restrictions that apply to us that don't apply to our friends and enemies overseas.
Sorry, so what's the...
would you like to comment on that?
On critical minerals?
Yes, sir.
Sure, yeah. I think that's a really no pun intended, critically important issue, and it's really top of mind for anyone who's involved in EVs, in part because no one that works in this technology wants to repeat the mistakes that we had made with oil and all of the tragedies that resulted from human rights abuses and other things around the developing and extraction of oil over the last 100 years, not to mention the harm it's caused the planet. I think when we're thinking about critical minerals, there's two major things we have to keep in mind. One, when batteries obviously go into EVs, but they also go into what's in our pockets, what's in our laptops. So it's a much broader issue than just transportation. And secondly, Nearly 95% of the critical minerals that go into a battery can actually be reused. A recent study by Stanford University estimated that innovative homegrown recycling from a company based in California called Redwood Materials, they can cut the environmental cost by 80%. And this company is expecting to recycle enough materials for 1 million EVs a year by 2025. So not an immediate solution, but there's a pathway where we don't have to be as dependent on developing countries for that.
As usual, when I get going down a good tunnel here, the time runs out. Madam Chairwoman, I yield back nothing to you.
Thank you for nothing. The gentleman yields back, and I recognize Mr. Duarte from California for 5 minutes for questions.
Well, perfect. I'm going to pick up where Mr. Burkett left off. Hope I pronounced the name right, Tim. I represent a low-income district in California, a rural district in California with farmers, and I am very suspect of the social equity claims made by the electric vehicle industry, criticizing, as you did, oil production, where it's from. We have some of the tightest labor markets, some of the best workforce opportunities in America for drilling of carbon fuels and delivery of carbon fuels today. It's undeniable. We've got plenty of work we could expand here and quit bringing in carbon fuels from around the globe where the environmental standards and workforce standards are much lower. But that's not the lowest we can talk about. The absolute human tragedy happening in the Congo right now as we speak, mining cobalt mainly, in slave labor conditions, child slavery conditions, forced slavery conditions, by mainly Chinese firms, we can say, because that's where all the batteries are made. And that's mainly who's operating over there. But you and I both know, we all know, this is proxy imperialism. This is America's political appetite being served through an imperialistic group in China, going in, grabbing the cobalt through slave labor, running it through probably slave labor factories in China, and selling us batteries that our federal government is subsidizing to serve. Yes, we want to talk about low-income households. They're not buying the electric vehicles. Electric vehicles are being purchased by rich people, by high-income individuals here in America. If they were truly economic, I think our working families would have enough common sense to buy them. They're not. Tesla's selling vehicles, and just last year alone, they just reported $1.78 billion in EV credits they sold to their competitors that produce a lot of gas vehicles that lower income families want to buy. So we have serious fair trade issues. We have serious economic equity issues with the forced expansion of the electric vehicle industry. And I don't even need to talk about the logistic difficulties / impossibilities of meeting these EV mandates. And we're also talking railroads, don't forget. I mean, so this gets more ludicrous as we unravel it. Mr. Nigro, am I wrong on this? Do we or do we not have forced slavery in Congo supplying this? Is this or is this not proxy imperialism through China? Do we not have slave labor embedded in every electric vehicle sold in America today that's subsidized by the federal government?
So I've already mentioned the sort of context issues. So let me just sort of pick up where you've left off here on the issue around batteries and critical minerals and dependency on countries who arguably do not share our values. You brought up Tesla. So they've been working with Panasonic. They've reduced the cobalt use in their batteries by 60%, and they actually have now a battery that's in many of their offerings from lithium iron phosphate batteries that actually have no cobalt at all. So
slave labor is okay for now because we might get past that later. Haven't we heard that argument somewhere in our history?
In a nutshell, it's like so many problems we face in transportation. This is about trying to innovate our way out of it. And the industry itself has set up an initiative called the Initiative for Responsible Mining Assurance.
Do you have any faith that that's taking place in preventing slave labor-derived elements in the Congo from reaching American markets and consumers with federal subsidies?
I think when it comes to resource extraction in general, it's about accountability and shining a light on these issues and making sure we set up a policy framework.
Do those exist? We've been at this for a while. Do those accountability mechanisms exist?
You at?
Yes, I'm asking you. You're saying what we should do, what we might do, what the future might hold, but I'm not hearing that we're holding ourselves to any humane standard whatsoever. I mean, we're in a country here that literally cares how a chicken lays an egg and how many piggies go in the pig pen so that people can buy pork and buy eggs, but we are subsidizing slave labor in foreign countries through proxy imperialism with our geopolitical enemies to force consumers to buy electric vehicles. This is ridiculous, isn't it?
I'll just say a couple of points here. This initiative for responsible mining assurance is recently joined General Motors, Ford, Volkswagen, Tesla, Rivian. This initiative has been around for over almost 20 years.
It's failing.
These automakers are now joining because they want to bring that accountability.
The federal government hasn't required any kind of fair trade. I'm dropping the Fair Trade EV Act, which simply says if you want to get a federal check to subsidize your electric vehicle purchase, that's fine. I'm sure you'll look cute in it. It's going to be certified by the manufacturer not to involve constituents or components derived from slave labor. Do you see a morality in that, or would you like us to ding-dong along with these initiatives longer?
I'm not sure of the details of this legislation, so I can't really comment on it. Sorry.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. Thank you. The gentleman yields back, and I recognize myself for 5 minutes for questions. Oh. All right, I'm gonna take my 5 minutes. Are you good? Okay. Mr. Drakos, I want to go to you. I'm concerned about the trucking industry and being able to move goods. I represent the 2nd District in Utah. We have 2 major freeways. A lot of goods move through my district. And I spend a lot of time driving. I have a very large district. I spend a lot of time at places like Love's and Maverick gas stations. And I know that trucks are only making money when they're moving. Do you know how long it takes a medium-duty truck to charge?
Thank you for that question. It depends. And by that, I mean it depends on the charge rate of the vehicle, what it'll accept, and it also depends on the charging rate of the charging infrastructure, the hardware. So in my experience, we put in 2 75 kilowatt DC fast chargers 3 years ago. That was fast, relatively fast. For our medium duty trucks, it takes a couple hours to charge. Our new electrification project that we're putting in Harrisburg, we're putting in a 600 kilowatt charging cabinet. The vehicles now can charge at 250 kilowatts, but it takes time. My biggest concern is parking and having access to charge over the road, because it is a significant challenge and problem. And then also when you look at the hours of service rules, I can't imagine what a driver is going to go through, that there are 10 chargers at a site, they're pulling in the charge, and sometime during their rest area, they have to wake up and move their rig to allow someone else on. So, but it's improving, but it can be a challenge that's going to impact operations today.
Okay. I had 4 questions to ask you about that, and you answered all of them in that answer. That was very impressive. Thank you. And before I wrap up, I just want to say thank you all for being here. I did this once. I came and testified in front of Congress way before I ever planned on running for Congress or knew I'd ever sit on this side. And I know it takes a lot of preparation, and you guys have been sitting here answering questions for a long time. So thank you for your preparation. Thank you for being here. My friend, Mr. Ezell, said, talked about good old American know-how, and I agree with him, but I feel like in the conversation we're having, we're sort of talking around good old American know-how and ignoring some realities. One of my favorite movies is Top Gun, the original one, the 1986 one. And there's a line in there. He says, your body's writing egos, or your ego's writing checks your body can't cash. And I'm afraid what we're doing here is our goals and our policies are writing a future that our infrastructure can't live up to. And I just want to finish with the same question for all of you. We'll start with Ms. Okafor. Actually, let's start with Mr. Nigro and move the other way. Mr. Nigro, can we actually meet the goals this administration has for electrification? Do we have the infrastructure, the capacity? Is it a realistic goal?
I'm an eternal optimist, so that's not a fair question. But yes,
Go ahead and answer.
I 100% believe that the engineering and capacity in this country and the know-how that we have with our businesses, with folks in the policy community, can come together and do this. Yes.
In the timelines that we've set?
Yes.
Okay. Mr. Drakos?
I'm an optimist, but I think I'm trying to be a realist as we move forward. And I think there are going to be some significant headwinds as we move forward. I think there's a lot of energy. There's a lot of great organizations and people that are trying to move this forward. But it is heavy lifting, and it is a challenge, and not everyone has the resources to move it forward, especially for small businesses and smaller organizations.
Mr. Cogan?
I think to meet the goal of 50% emission reductions by 2030 is attainable, very much so. To get to zero emission by 2050 with current technology and current funding, I think is going to be a really heavy lift.
Thank you. Ms. Okafor?
Absolutely. If I may, I did want to address the question that you asked earlier regarding the amount of power needed to charge a truck. If we were,
Do it quickly.
I'll do it very quickly. At a typical truck stop, you have 8 to 10 lanes to fuel a heavy duty truck. In order to do that with an electric truck, you would need to put in megawatt chargers. You would need to put in 10 megawatt chargers. That's more power than the Empire State Building in New York. That's a significant amount of power in rural America. That would be extremely challenging. To answer your question directly, in order to make this work, it has to be something that the American consumer wants to buy. If they don't want to buy it, if you don't have the demand, then you don't have the economic structure that investors would want to invest in. So the challenge there is having both sides do this. We've done it before with the biodiesel market, having a two-sided incentive structure. Without that, I think it would be a challenge to get there.
Thank you. I'm concerned that we have these goals, but a goal without a plan is just a wish, and a wish is not policy. So with that, thank you. The gentlelady yields back. Are there further questions from any members of the committee who have not been recognized? Seeing none, that concludes our hearing for today. I'd like to thank each of the witnesses for your testimony. The committee stands adjourned.